welcome to Saturday Night at the Movies, the podcast that celebrates classic, cult, and current films and the people that made them, and many other aspects of pop culture. I'm your host, Steve Rubin. Our producer's Ben Shrewsbury, and our signature theme was composed by Greg Lerhoff. Here it's always Saturday night, and our mission is to chronicle film and pop cultural history one memory at a time. Tonight, we're going to delve into one of the most controversial and simultaneously fascinating moments in the history of Hollywood. It takes place in 1950 during the early days of the Korean War and in the midst of the blacklist scandals plaguing Hollywood, which have come to the door of what was then called the Screen Directors Guild. It pits legendary director Cecil B. DeMille, he of the great biblical epics, versus soon-to-be double Oscar winner, director, and relative newcomer to Hollywood, Joe Mankiewicz. Joining me on this discussion will be my partners in a film dramatization of these events, what we call the Battle for Hollywood. Former Showtime president of programming, Jerry Offsay, screenwriter, author, and college professor Steve Molton, and film historian and writer Avie Hern. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thank you, Steve.
Thanks, Steve. Good to be here.
So let's, for those of you who are listening at home or in your car or on YouTube watching us, some of you aren't familiar with, probably many of you aren't familiar with this story, but it probably is important to set the context of when it took place. Avi, can you tell us a little bit what the world was like in 1950? What were people thinking about a lot, particularly in Hollywood?
Well, it's complicated. The war had ended. 1950, the war had been over for 5 years. And the country was settling into normalcy, economic normalcy. But the Cold War had taken over from the hot war, World War II. And the Cold War was being used by certain unscrupulous forces to jockey for political advantage. I mean, HUAC was not a HUAC had existed. The House Un-American Activities Committee had actually been formed in the late 1930s to look for fascist influence in the United States, and then it was retooled by conservatives at the end after World War II to make it a communist hunting organization. And my feeling about it is that, and I think most of us have seen some footage of the hearings and how many of the people who had been called before the hearings, most notably what came to be known as the Unfriendly 10, and then became known as the Hollywood 10, try to defend themselves. Unfortunately, I don't think anybody defended himself in a way that was particularly effective. I mean, obviously, the people running the committee would basically shut them down if they weren't hearing what they wanted to hear. And in fact, when they weren't hearing what they wanted to hear, they would simply declare that the witnesses were in contempt of Congress, and they'd have them sentenced to jail. And that's when the Hollywood 10 went to jail, not because they were communists, which was legal, but because
I'm gonna throw up an image here, literally throw it up. This gentleman, Jerry, who are we looking at here?
We're looking at the late and not lamented Senator Joe McCarthy from the great state of Wisconsin, and a mean, angry, can I say son of a bitch on this?
Absolutely.
Steve?
You can go worse.
Good. That's the nicest thing that I could probably think of to say about him. But he was what they call a red baiting. He saw communists under every pillow. He partially went after homosexuals at the same time that he was going after communists. He somehow equated the two. But he was the chief villain in the drama, along with a lawyer or two that he enlisted to help him in his endeavors. And he went on TV as often as he could to call people out. And he particularly went after the army. The army was full of communists. The army that had just bravely fought that war in Europe and emerged victorious and was about to go off and fight in Korea. Or by the time he really got his hearings up and going, we were well into a Korean War. The army was full of communists. Hollywood was full of communists. Everybody was a communist, according to Mr. McCarthy. So that's the environment that Avie was talking about. That the rise or the fear of Russia had infected the entire populace of the United States.
Well,
Yeah.
I mean, Jerry mentioned McCarthy's lawyer without mentioning his name. And of course, that was Roy Cohn, at whose knee Donald Trump learned everything he knows. And the two most important lessons he was taught by Cohn was always assassinate character and never back down. No matter how you
never apologize.
Never back down.
What were you going to say, Steve?
I was just going to say that the climate of paranoia after the war, the kind of mass trauma of the war, it pushed us into. Patton was about this to a degree, and MacArthur, and et cetera. It was sort of like after such an orgy of violence in the two world wars, it was as if we couldn't stop fighting, and and they might be anywhere, and you might have to fight like down the street. You might have to kill your neighbor. I mean, there was that kind of fever loose in the country, I think, with McCarthyism, just because. Communism was the antithesis of capitalism. What had we won? What was the culture that was resulting from all of this? And the storytellers in the middle of it in Hollywood and in New York were trying to make sense of it all. And try to these were McCarthy was tapping into a very, very ancient thing, which is just the scapegoat. Let's find a scapegoat because the society itself was very discombobulated after the war. You got to aim all that energy towards somebody who's the baddie. And people like Mankiewicz and DeMille were upholding the cultural America, which in my book is much more democratic than political America. And even then there was, well, that gets into another thing, but I just wanted to add.
I was just going to say that Soviet Russia was our ally for
During the war, yeah.
4 years, and the Hollywood writers, many of whom were writing propaganda films, were able to tell stories about the Russians as good guys. And in fact, there were a number of films that came out that they kind of whitewashed a little bit. There was one famous one. It was a Mission to Moscow. Was that?
Yes, directed by Michael Curtiz with Walter Houston as
Right.
Ambassador Joseph Davies, basically holding together the alliance between the United States and Russia.
No, the thing I was going to ask Jerry about, Jerry, when you being an attorney, there obviously are laws of the land that seem to go out the window when certain situations take place. Obviously, the parallels between the red baiting era of the 50s and today are quite startling. What could lawyers do in situations like that? Or are they simply powerless?
So, there's a thing called the canon of ethics. Doesn't matter what state you're a member of the bar in, every state has a canon of ethics. Part of that canon of ethics is that you're literally not just in court, but you're not supposed to, as a lawyer, make a public statement that's untrue. That's just part of, you can be disciplined by the Bar Association for making untrue public statements. And Roy Cohn, who was Joe McCarthy's, McCarthy made untrue statements like he was breathing. Good morning, he lied is a most often applied to Hollywood agents, but in the case of McCarthy, it was the way he acted at all times, and his lawyer. Who was influencing who at that time? It's hard to tell because they were, it was two devils, working together to undermine whatever institution they decided that week they wanted to go after. And Hollywood was, sexy and made for good headlines, and the two of them trained their guns on Hollywood, and they actually succeeded in jailing people.
What Jerry just said is in many ways analogous to the fact to, and we'll get into it more later, I'm sure. DeMille had two men around him named Vernon Keyes, who was the executive director of the Directors Guild, and a journeyman director named Al Rogel. And Steve Molton, correctly, when we were working on the film, on the project many years ago, described Keyes and Rogel as DeMille's Iagos. And I think that, that's exactly right. And I think, that yeah, I mean, as Jerry says, I mean, which one was Othello and which one was Iago between McCarthy and Cohn, we really can't know. But of course, McCarthy had all the power. He had the political power, which Cohn did not.
So Avie, tell us a little bit about Cecil B. DeMille. This is 1950 as our story begins. For people who aren't familiar with him, other than the guy who does those biblical movies, what do we know about his world?
Well, I mean, DeMille was one of the founders of Hollywood. He came out here in 1912 to make a movie. He was, partnered with Adolf Zukor and Sam Goldwyn, and they sent him out here on a train. And there's a story that he got off the train in Flagstaff, Arizona, and it was either raining or snowing. And he said, "No, well, this is no good. I'm gonna just get back on the train until I get to a place where it isn't raining or snowing." But the real reason he got back on the train in Flagstaff is because they had bought a play. The three men had bought a play called The Squaw Man. And it specified that it took place in Wyoming. And DeMille had seen photographs of Wyoming, and he got on Flagstaff and didn't look like Wyoming. And nowadays you would ask, well, does it have to be Wyoming? But back then it said what? The play script said Wyoming. It's got to be Wyoming. So he just got off the train when he finally got to a place that looked like Wyoming. And because LA has a wide range of landscapes and topography. So, but he's one of the people who helped build this town, and he became the nation's storytelling grandpa, where basically he would put the public on his knee and tell them a story. And they were very comfortable with that. And he parlayed that into just a position of enormous trust among the public that he would deliver something that they would like.
He's the Spielberg of his era.
I'm sorry?
He's the Spielberg of his era.
Yeah, but beyond that, because again, I mean, Spielberg. I mean, I agree with you in terms of having his finger on the pulse of America. Although Joe Mankiewicz would phrase it that DeMille had his finger up the pulse of America. But DeMille, the thing is that at the time of this crisis, and he went head to head with Mankiewicz. DeMille had far more to lose than Mankiewicz did. He had 40 years of building up this reputation and everything. And whereas Mankiewicz was kind of, when this was going on, he was kind of grousing, well, I'd rather just move back to New York and direct operas for the rest of my life.
Excuse me. Did we actually set up the story for the audience as to what this was all about? I don't think
I was going to get to that by establishing who DeMille and Mankiewicz are, but why don't you take the rein? In fact, let me just put up another image here, just so we have some context. We've shown DeMille. Let's put up Joe Mankiewicz. Why don't you give it to us, Steve?
Well, I would just sort of pare it down to the crescendo of all of this was a gigantic crypto investigation by McCarthy, thus the name McCarthyism. And he targeted the arts, and mostly because he was targeting communicators, because it was sort of a battle of two stories about America. And DeMille's whole thing had been a franchise to create a certain kind of thing about American history. And suddenly he was encountering all these young bloods who had fought the war, who came back and wanted to tell something closer to the reality of American history. And that's where McCarthyism started to drive a cultural wedge. And we're now in a cultural war that is 10 times that size. But the deal finally was that Mankiewicz, who was an up-and-coming, brilliant young font of creativity making movies, was the head of the Directors Guild, and DeMille was the old guard. He was the granddaddy of everything, of the whole industry in a sense. And as McCarthyism was pushing people into camps, the camps descended upon the Directors Guild of America as well, which was a form of cultural power that was sort of the only thing that maybe Washington could get really nervous about, because they realized that we had a megaphone of our own. So that collision between DeMille and Mankiewicz was the analog to the anti-communist DeMillian, hysterics kind of that moment, and the new guard, which was basically this truly is a democracy. We just fought for a damn democracy. We got one, and everybody gets to have a voice. And we don't believe that just because you have far left views means you're an enemy of the state.
Well,
So that's the setup of what, if I may, just I'll bow out because Avie can now give us the sort of particulars. But
Well,
that I think just wanted to establish for the
oh, no,
viewer.
that's very good. But before you jump in, Avi, let me just mention the fact that the inciting incident, which is always the interesting moment in a movie, is DeMille requests that the every director sign a loyalty oath, because DeMille did not want to have any communists in the Screen Directors Guild. So basically, in those days, organizations would have what they call the mandatory loyalty oath, and then they could tell the government, if everybody signed it, we are communist free. But Avi, I'll turn it over to you.
thanks. Well, firstly, let me just expand on what you said for a moment. I would say the inciting incident here is actually when DeMille, in May of 1950, proposed Mankiewicz to nominate him to be president of the guild, because he thought he would be very pliable and would just be, DeMille's toady way. And to put dramatically, to put this story into context, this is really no different from Robert Bolt's A Man for All Seasons. This is Henry VIII choosing Thomas More to be his chancellor. So that, and then when he asked Thomas More to sign off on his divorce from Catherine of Aragon so he could marry Anne Boleyn to have a male heir, More said no, as a matter of principle. And the battle was joined between them, and it ended up with More getting his head chopped off. And obviously, Bolt wouldn't have had a story unless More had had his head chopped off. I mean, that's, it's the alpha and the omega of that story. But let me get back to McCarthy. McCarthy gave this process its name, but he was a senator. He was in the Senate. This was being prosecuted by the House Un-American Activities Committee, and obviously McCarthy approved of what they were doing, and maybe he consulted with them on a regular basis. We don't really know. But the committee in the House was being led by two men named Martin Dies and J. Parnell Thomas. Thomas eventually went to prison on tax evasion charges. You can draw your conclusions. You can draw what conclusions you like from that. And what I wanted to get back into for a moment, I was about to touch on, is that the process of communist witch hunting is a process older than politics itself. It is, you declare a crisis and then you tell the public that only you can solve it. If only you
Sounds familiar.
give us the power. But ultimately, the power you want really isn't to solve this non-existent crisis, to do something else that enriches you. And that's what the Republican Party is still doing. I mean, it's like they're asking, they're over wokeness. They're harvesting votes, but they're harvesting votes from people who can't really give them anything other than their votes. They want to serve capital. They want to serve the wealthy, and the wealthy then turn around and reward them for their tireless service on their behalf. But they need that power. So they go into wokeness and say, oh, we're going to save you from this. And also the thing about, in 1950, during the Cold War, America had spies in Russia, and Russia had spies in America. It's just the game that was being played. But the spies in America were not Hollywood screenwriters and directors and producers. What the Kremlin was doing is that they were, it's like a Hitchcock film, where the villains get tired of being, get tired of the hero being, trying to find out why he's, involved with all this. So they conspire to frame him for a crime, and it's usually murder, and like a North by Northwest. And by doing so, they enlist the police to magnify their own power. In this case, the Kremlin enlisted the unwitting services of the House American Activities Committee to foster that feeling of paranoia that Steve Molton talked about, to have Americans at each other's throats. That's what this was really accomplishing, and that's what it was. So the committee was actually playing into the Kremlin's hands. Whether they understood that or not, I don't know, but because they had their own.
And it's a fantastically repeating cycle.
Yes.
And the way, and these are dueling propaganda systems, right? The Russians have always been very nimble at looking at our prevailing, completely open system and insinuating themselves into it to create disassembly within the United States, and that's always perils of democracy. Is that everything becomes maybe equally true, and we start eating our young. We're at each other's throats, and that was the moment that we were in. And Hollywood was the scariest thing that a guy like McCarthy could look at, but also the State Department. So he wanted a transcultural battle. He was going to fight it on every front he could, much as we see now, and with very certain stakes. I want to get back to something Avie was saying about the real sort of psychological core of this movie, and the question of power that arises in the movie, power and personal principle. The way that DeMille regarded Mankiewicz early on was like, he's a hot young thing, and he's got a big brain, and he's making a lot of movies, and he's like I was 40, 30 years ago, and I can control him. There's something about him makes me think I can be his puppeteer. So it really was a fascinating overreach on the part of DeMille, who knows how much he was. I mean, everybody was supposed to be anti-communist, and he was going to go with whatever where the wind blew because he was a pop artist. He knew how to read the tea leaves, right? But so that's a fascinating dimension of this too. Is that it's really the story of somebody who was taken for granted and taken as a weak person who had to find strength that they didn't know they had, and had to identify principles within themselves that nobody ever asked them to identify particularly, which is what we're all faced with right now as well.
Go ahead, Jerry.
Anyway, go ahead, Jerry.
A couple of things. Number one, DeMille thought that he was being a great patriot. He didn't think that he was a bad guy.
Right.
He thought that he was doing the right thing for the country, just the way, or he cloaked himself in the argument that this was the patriotic thing to do, the way we see people now, waving the flag and thinking that they're doing right by the country while they're, ignoring a lot of the constitutional principles. If DeMille had read the Constitution, which I'm not sure he ever had, he wouldn't have gone out and tried to impose a loyalty oath, because if anything was un-American, it was trying to take people's employment away from them because of their political views. It's antithetical to freedom of speech and freedom of association and a few other freedoms that I won't, bother to enumerate right now. But he did that, under the guise or under the sincere belief that he was helping to eliminate a threat to his beloved country. And he was being patriotic, and he really couldn't understand the fact why anybody would object to signing a loyalty oath. There was something wrong with you if you wouldn't sign that loyalty oath. Secondly, I want to go back to one of the things that was just alluded to by Steve in talking about the Russians. When you talk about the Russians, you talk about, their actions in dealing with America. You're most often talking about the KGB and and Steve and I worked extensively on another project, and it's sort of on the back burner now, that dealt a lot with the KGB. And the guiding principle of the KGB as it relates to America was laid out by the head of the KGB, you know,
Lavrentiy Beria.
75 years ago, when he basically came to the conclusion that they would never be able to militarily beat the United States. The only way they were going to be able to beat the United States was to have the United States defeat itself, to turn people in the United States against each other. And their propaganda and the work that they do, which we've seen all the way through, which we saw in 2016 in the work that they did to elect the current president at that time, it is to amplify discord that's going on in the United States, to turn Black Lives Matters into an evil thing, instead of something that is trying to protect Black people from being killed by policemen. They put out a never-ending stream of propaganda. They put out things that are completely fake, and they find, now they have a megaphone that's much, much greater because of the internet, but they make up stories. They wrote fake books. They were heavily involved in convincing the people in the United States not to trust the Warren Commission. And so there were really evil people that were working against the interest of the United States, but they were Russians, and they were not the Hollywood 10 or anybody else who in 1938 in their youth went to, some party with a bunch of socialists, and who then, a dozen years later was being called to account because somebody gave them a cigarette, lit their cigarette, and that person was a known communist, and they guilt by association. You don't hear that much about guilt by association at all in the United States, thankfully, but that was completely what these people were doing. You sat in a room with people who were communists, therefore, either you give us the names of other people who were communists, or we're going to jail you for failing to cooperate with us. That's largely the tactic. And so when somebody like DeMille, says to the people, sign a loyalty oath, he's not using that kind of tactic. He's just saying, he's imposing his view of what he thinks is right on other people who have different political views, and it's none of his business. But he made it his business, and he brought every director in Hollywood was put under the gun, because it became a hot issue within the members of the guild as to whether this thing was going to be imposed on them or not, and if it was imposed, who were going to be the casualties of that. Because the guild was going to certify to the government that they had no communists, and anybody who didn't sign it then by a negative implicate was then going to be branded as a communist.
Exactly.
Well, from Mankiewicz's point of view, it was not the loyalty oath that he objected to. He objected to its being mandatory. It was voluntary. He had no objection to it.
There's a great moment in our story, by the way, which was originally written by Don Mankiewicz.
I'm just going to get some water.
Yes, sure.
I will do. I'll be right back. Hold on.
Sure.
Well, you tell our audience, because I think we probably remember. You go ahead.
I think you do. Basically, what happened was, Joe has just directed All About Eve, and he decides to go on vacation. So he and his wife travel to Europe, and they go to Paris, and he has already told. Actually, I should preface by the fact that DeMille brings the subject of a mandatory loyalty oath up at a typical Directors Guild meeting thinking that Mankiewicz will just rubber stamp the whole thing. And what happens is that Joe says, no, no, this isn't the State Department. This is the Screen Directors Guild. We help our members get jobs. We're not interested in their political affiliations. So DeMille is taken aback, and the subject is tabled at that moment. But Joe goes off on vacation to Paris, and DeMille decides to call a vote behind his back. And so when Mankiewicz arrives back in New York, he's all these press people are saying, "What do you think about the mandatory oath?" And he basically says, "What mandatory oath?" And it turns out that DeMille has done a vote. I think there were 525 directors who agreed, and there were something like 28 who didn't. So at the next Union Hall meeting, Mankiewicz tells DeMille, "Well, now that you've done this, we have a blacklist." And Mankiewicz, of course, DeMille is horrified that anybody would claim that there's a blacklist at the Screen Directors Guild. But Mankiewicz tells him, "Listen, do you think those names are going to remain hidden forever? Somebody's going to find that out." So DeMille realizes then and there that Mankiewicz is not going to be an ally, and then the war breaks out. The title of our movie is The Battle for Hollywood, and literally a war breaks out between these two giants of the industry.
Well, I'd like to go back to what Jerry was saying a few moments ago. One was about communists in the United States is that the Russians felt that American communists, they called them useful idiots, but they didn't trust them. I mean, they had some, again, their actual spying, their actual dirty work were left to their homegrown people because it was the only ones they trusted. The other thing is when he's discussing, DeMille did not see himself as a villain. What Jerry's describing in a fictional film, that's a well-written villain. When a villain does not think of himself as a villain. And I like to look at a film like Shane, where there's after the 4th of July celebration, and Shane and the Starretts are coming back to their homestead, and Riker, the villain and his men are waiting for them. And at first, I love scenes with the reversals, and it starts off on a fairly friendly note where Riker is describing how he and other men like him had come to that country decades before and had carved the wilderness out, made it a decent place to live because they are the ones who conquered the Indians and carved it out. And everything Riker is saying makes sense. He's got a valid point on almost every point. He's a villain not because he has an abhorrent point of view, but because his methods are abhorrent. And I think that's largely true of DeMille too.
Oh yeah. No. Go, Steve, you're about to say something?
Well, no, I think we've said it. Jerry is pointing out that there was a certain kind of legitimacy to the fact that when you defeat a totalitarian, two totalitarian countries in a war, and then you turn around and realize one of your allies is also totalitarian, maybe it was inevitable that we would be fighting against the Russians and et cetera. And of course, we were for 50 years. But this was that inflection point that really is about personal privacy. That's why as soon as there was a loyalty oath involved, it was an intrusion on the freedom you fought for in the minds of Mankiewicz and people and that faction within the guild and within the nation overall. And that to me is sort of one of the sacred aspects of the themes of the movie. Is it's finally like that's between me and me. Whether you don't get, I don't have to attest to my love of the country to you or to anyone, because there's a point in which democracy is private, right? You have a private life. You have a right to a private life, and that became that flashpoint in the story. And we're speaking of it because we know it so well, and we know LA so well, as though it was really, kind of a giant factional kind of rhetorical dispute. But it got really deep and really emotional for everybody because they were on the line. They were the nation's storytellers at a moment when the country desperately needed the news story to be told.
Fascinating moment. What I always loved about this story, and it's the fact that all of the characters are pretty much film directors, and they're not frontline soldiers. These are guys who direct movies for a living, and there are two camps. Mankiewicz has Ilya Kazan, who's having his own trouble at that time because he was about to be called before the committee. He had Billy Wilder and William Wyler, John Huston, and a gentleman who I think was one of the key players in this battle, and that was, of course, George Stevens, as you can see here on the set of Giant. George Stevens becomes a key player in this piece because he starts to keep track of the facts. DeMille compounds his, yes, he believes he's a hero doing the right thing with a compulsory loyalty oath, but he also starts to do some really illegal things like calling for a recount, or not a recount, a recall election to get rid of Mankiewicz, and only sending out the first missives to his followers.
Well, illegal isn't quite right, but underhanded certainly, deeply devious. But getting back
unethical.
I'm sorry?
Unethical.
Yes, that means at the very least. I want to get to Steve Molton was saying. One thing that hasn't been touched on yet is that one of the things that one of the goals that House Un-American Activities Committee had, that if they were successful in what they were after, was to achieve a long-standing goal of the American right wing and the Protestant establishment, is to wrest the control of the film industry from the hands of the Jews. And the other one is it goes to MAGA. Trump, the Make America Great Again. But what makes America great again, what makes any nation great, is that we all give our neighbors the benefit of the doubt, that our neighbors are honest until they say or do something that shows us they are dishonest, that they are kind unless they say or do something that shows they are unkind, that they're etc. I mean, you get the idea. And Trump has turned us into a nation of cannibals, where it's just the opposite. You have their faction that their default position is that everybody is rotten and against them until they prove that they are not rotten and against them. And a nation cannot survive that. It will tear itself to pieces.
So let me jump back in here and talk about the little parameter of our story. One of the key third act of the story takes place at the Beverly Hills Hotel in October 22nd, 1950. By the way, this year it will be 75 years. Gives us a little bit more ammunition, perhaps, in getting the story at least moving. And of course, after, and I won't go into all the details because we don't want to give away our whole movie, but essentially, this war that broke out between Cecil B. DeMille and Joe Mankiewicz eventually leads to a union hall meeting, a full union hall meeting with every possible director they can cram into the ballroom.
The senior directors
at the Beverly Hills Hotel. So every director of note ends up going to the union hall meeting that night, and it becomes essentially the trial of Joe Mankiewicz. So it almost becomes a courtroom drama at the end, with both sides presenting their cases. And I found that a fascinating period. And we were fortunate enough to find the actual transcript of that meeting. It's like 400 pages. It was a 7-hour meeting. And there are a lot of interesting things that come out of the meeting. Jerry, when we brought this to your attention, first of all, you knew about this case. It was familiar to you, wasn't it?
Yeah, I knew about it in part because one of the key figures in that meeting was turned out to be John Ford, unexpectedly, because he took a position that maybe people didn't think he was. He was the sort of great Western, made these Westerns, and they expected him to take the conservative right-wing view. And I don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves, but it's a famous story about John Ford, and I knew a lot about John Ford. I'd seen all of his movies. It was one of the reasons that I wanted to be in this business, and so through my knowledge of Ford, I knew about this. And so when you guys came in with the idea, I'm sitting there nodding my head like this, saying, yeah, wonder, in a sense, for mainstream America, this is a very, very obscure story. It's a battle between a bunch of directors, and you sit there, as I did at the time as the buyer, and I'm saying to myself, okay, how are we going to make people care about this thing that happened in 1950? Now 25 years after, I said yes to you guys, let's go write this script. The story is more relevant now than it's ever been. It is right now. Uh, we are watching history repeat itself. We're not calling it the House Un-American Activities Committee. We're calling it Doge. We're, we are in a situation where people are using protecting. I mean, crazily enough, we're seeing people using protecting Jews, the idea of protecting Jews, to destroy universities, to cut off medical research. What
Yeah.
Jewish people are there out there that think it's a great idea to take away $2 billion from Harvard that is mainly used for investigating cures for cancer, diabetes, heart disease, whatever, and and as a Jewish person who's fairly observant and sent all his kids to Jewish day school, and thinks about these things through a Jewish perspective, the notion that these people are hiding behind that, or wearing this, their wolves in sheep's clothing, is horrifying. It's just absolutely horrifying. And there's a tremendous parallel between what these people who thought they were great patriots were doing back then to sanitize America from the evil influence of these communists, and the people who want to sanitize America from anybody who has a dissenting point of view. And that's not to say that anti-Semitism is not a terrible, tremendous problem. I grew up in an anti-Semitic neighborhood in the Bronx. I suffered from it. I was picked on in the street. I had beer bottles thrown at me, when I walked home from dates on Saturday night. And I really thought that it was largely behind us and me. And the war in the Middle East is polarized people in a way, that we haven't seen before, or we haven't seen for 75 years. But the motives of the people who are out there trying to right this wrong of anti-Semitism are about as impure as the motives of those people who were out there trying to right the wrong of communism in America. It is a false, if you will, it's a false flag operation that they're running. They're saying one thing and cloaking themselves as great patriots, and they're doing tremendous, tremendous harm to the country and the people that they're, in theory, trying to protect.
Well, it's a smokescreen. It's like everybody
Right.
loves the Jews when it's politically expedient, which isn't very often. And here's Trump claiming that he wants to cleanse all this anti-Semitism from Harvard and American universities, and then he's going to dinners with cryptocurrency investors on whose crypto coins they've stamped "fuck the Jews."
Yeah, I mean, it's I'm a Columbia Law graduate, and they'll Columbia was the first important institution to wave the white flag of surrender to the blackmail of the new government, and I don't know a single person that I know from law school who isn't appalled beyond belief, who is intending to cut off whatever donations they make. I know people who are changing their wills literally to take away their bequests that they were going to make to Columbia, and
And I'm
and
going
on
back there to work and to fall under a consent decree.
yeah, and on the contrary, I have a son who went to Harvard, and I haven't given them any um, money for a while, but you could be sure that when the envelope comes around this year, I'm going to make a donation to them. And because they're being punished for the audacity of standing up for principle and not allowing themselves to be blackmailed. And
Well, the parallels here are astonishing. Like you point out
Yeah.
when we did
So
this. Yeah,
this is now an important. This movie is important because people will be able to see. Oh, you know, it was happening then, and history is repeating itself again right now, and and
I think
you
we,
know,
yeah, I think I would just like to assert too that in the climax of this movie, a tremendous collision between cultural power and political power is occurring at the Beverly Hills Hotel, in which the people who create the kind of widest possible view of America, and I knew people like Jack Guilford, I knew Elia Kazan, I knew some of the folks who were blacklisted and others who were, caught up in it all. The moment we were in there is the moment we're in now times 1,000, because it's a matter of people trying to discern the truth and tell the truth about what the country is, as opposed to a mythic sort of pat on the back of what the country is. And now we're true, as far as I'm concerned, we're truly in a battle between two narratives. The one that reflects the reality of the country and one that does not. And that's what the whole loyalty oath was about. It's sort of like, no, do you have to reflect this one mono view of what the narrative of the country is, or you're dishonest, you're disloyal to the country. So that the energy that's building now, and the way in which the cultural pushback it was happening there with Mankiewicz and that faction, with Weiler and Kazan and this one and that one, is now being manifested in things like Bruce Springsteen and Taylor Swift. Neil Young standing up and saying, "We're not afraid of you." All the myriad other ways in which the free press and the free artists and this community and the rebounding of the counterculture. It's like, hey, I got to live long enough to be in the counterculture twice, because the kids don't seem to be coming along very rapidly. So we're going to have to show them how it's done. But that's why this movie, I think, is so pertinent to the moment. Is that this was like Concord, Concord or Lexington, in the battle that we're now fighting now at a much larger scale.
Shot heard went around the world.
Just just to show the audience how important this project was perceived back in when we first brought it to Jerry, uh, directors like Sidney Lumet, Arthur Penn, Dan Petrie, Peter Bogdanovich were all over this. They were very interested, and our goal these days is to find directors of that ilk again. Well, this has
let
been
me let me let me let me just throw something in though, because this has been a very heady discussion. But one of the things that also made this thing unique and uniquely appealing is that before they get to the climatic meeting, there is a great action scene in what otherwise is a thought-provoking intellectual movie. So can Molton talk about the motorcycle
Oh yeah, it's my
riders?
favorite. That's my favorite part of the film movie.
Avi, run that down. Go ahead.
Well, what happened is that DeMille. Well, there was going to be a vote on recalling Mankiewicz's presidency, and DeMille conspired with. It's a little unclear as to. Most likely, it was a motorcycle brigade a right-wing motorcycle brigade that had been formed by some of Hollywood's most conservative individuals, such as Victor McLaglen and Ward Bond, to send out motorcycle riders to the people DeMille knew would be on his side in the middle of the night, and that Mankiewicz, people who would support Mankiewicz, wouldn't get their ballots till the next day, and the votes had already been counted by the time that DeMille's supporters got the ballots. DeMille made two mistakes. One is that he sent out all these rumbling hogs, these motorcycles, out like the middle of Beverly Hills and Bel Air in the middle of the night, which you can imagine what that sounded like. You know, those peaceful lanes of Beverly Hills and Bel Air. And this is one of those cases,
To the Jews of Beverly Hills and Bel Air.
Yeah, well, excuse me.
And to the Jews of Beverly Hills
Well,
and
yeah,
Bel
but DeMille
motorcycle in the middle of the night. Yeah.
What you had also was like Benjamin Franklin's old saying, for want of a nail, the horseshoe was lost. One of the horseshoe, the message was lost. One of the message, the kingdom was lost. DeMille, one of the people that one of these writers gave a ballot to was the director John Farrow, the wife of the husband of Maureen Sullivan, the mother of Mia Farrow, the father of Mia Farrow. And he thought that he would be on his side. He wasn't. He was a friend of Herman Mankiewicz's, and he gave the ballot to Herman Mankiewicz, and Herman called his brother Joe and said, you better, this is what they're doing, and you better do something about it right now, in the middle of the night. So, because of that one misplaced ballot, it may have cost DeMille his advantage, his leverage in this advantage. And I have this wonder, because again, it's the one big action set piece in the whole movie, and I have this wonderful image of it with, again, these motorcycles riding. It's basically just a montage where, and it's scored with the circus march from DeMille's Greatest Show on Earth. And where so they're roaming the Beverly Hills, and suddenly you just see the like Beverly Hills, like just a dark trees against the skylight, and like lights start coming on against.
Okay, Avie,
the whole community is awakened by these motorcycles.
I think you're playing director, which is not surprising since all we're talking about is directors. Well, this conversation could go on forever. For everybody who's listening and watching, the movie is called The Battle for Hollywood. We are in development and hopefully going to be attaching elements soon. We're going to get it moving in the right direction. Gentlemen, any last thoughts you want to give on this subject? Steve?
Well, do you want to I teased the John Ford role in this thing. And you could leave the audience hanging as to what happened at this meeting.
I could set
what are you going to say to them? If you want to know how it ended, you'll have to see the movie.
Well, it's a classic moment. Basically, Mankiewicz has been pummeled all night. There have been a lot of things said against him, and John Ford apparently was sitting not in a chair. He was sitting on the dais, chewing on a towel for 7 hours. Finally, and it's saying nothing.
Which is what he always did on a movie set. He always
like chewing on something. So he, all of a sudden, 7 hours after this Union Hall meeting begins, he stands up and approaches the dais. It's almost like Moses approaching the dais. And everybody defers to John Ford. He comes up to the table, comes up to the lectern, speaks into the microphone. My name is Jack Ford. I make Westerns. That's how he introduces himself.
He undersells himself. Very humble.
And then he starts to talk about how important Cecil B. DeMille is. Cecil B. DeMille started this business. I don't like what people are saying about DeMille. So all of a sudden, Mankiewicz and all of his guys are thinking, oh, holy Christ, this is the end, because Ford is going to come down to it. So he's saying all these great things about DeMille. And then finally, he says, but tonight I don't like Cecil B. DeMille. And a hush falls over the crowd, and he begins to tell everybody what DeMille has done. It was wrong, and the tide turns. It is literally like a courtroom drama where testimony is finally presented that exonerates Mankiewicz. And it's one of the great moments in Hollywood history. And I would say, even though the blacklist did not end for another decade, I think in many ways it was one of the first stones thrown against the world that was happening, that the red baiting, all of that going on in Hollywood. And it's a magnificent moment. Jerry, thank you for reminding us because I think this has so much color in it and so many interesting characters and situations. Gentlemen, Steve, do you have another thought?
One more thought, which is that what was being expected of Hollywood at that moment was to conform. And there are those of us who have been trying to move fairly political projects through the system that have sort of received a tacit word that nobody's going to move those projects through the system right now. That it's very difficult to find a place for those things. So that's the other chilling effect that we're also looking at. That I think this is not sort of gilded in aspic, it's not just something a relic from the past. We're now once again in that question of how's America going to tell its own story? How free are we going to be to tell every aspect of the story? Or are we going to have is there going to be yet again a monolithic notion of who is allowed to have the power to reach audiences and who isn't? And
Well,
that's where
look at what's happening at 60 Minutes right now. Again, if you want to find, talk about a chilling effect. The president of the United States has sued CBS for billions of dollars, and on the grounds that 60 Minutes did something wrong and the head of CBS News and the person who's run 60 Minutes have walked out the door there because they're talking about they have to not only pay him, $25 million or whatever for the insult that he suffered, but but give him an apology. And these journalists weren't countenancing that. And now were they forced out as sort of a sop to the president, or did they walk out with their heads held high? We don't know, but it appears that they have taken the principled stand and weren't going to stand for the fact that the CBS and 60 Minutes were going to bend the knee and kiss the ring of Mr. Drumpf. But if you can force CBS News into bending your way, then who is it that's going to make a movie that has a point of view that might be critical of or unpopular with the current powers that be?
It happened with the movie The Apprentice. The Apprentice got virtually very little distribution, and it was I didn't see it, but the performances by Jeremy Strong and the guy who played Trump was supposed to be extraordinary. So we all have our challenges here. Gentlemen, I hate to end this wonderful discussion, but we've had a chance to talk about a project that is very dear to our hearts and minds. And I appreciate the conversation. Everyone who's been listening and watching, this is Saturday Night at the Movies. I'm your host, Steve Rubin. Our producer is Ben Shrewsbury. Please watch us now we now have a channel on YouTube and, of course, on your favorite podcast platforms. You're watching it now. And then I have another podcast, Tales from Hollywoodland. Check that out as well. Thank you, everybody. Gentlemen, thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you, guys.